This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. On the local news roundup, Hurricane Dorian ravages the Bahamas and brings damage to the Carolinas. We have the latest. A three-judge panel strikes down the state's legislative districts, calling them an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander, and orders a redraw by September the 18th. The 9th District election is almost at the finish line in what appears to be a very tight race. The candidates weigh in. More talk about the proposed sales tax for the arts and discussions about transparency over how the money might be spent, and our schools get their report card. Our roundtable of reporters is ready to detail those and other stories, and those reporters include Steve Harrison, political reporter for WFAE News. Good morning.
Good morning, Mike.
David Borax is here, also from WFAE News. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, Mike.
Mary C. Curtis is here. She's a columnist for Roll Call and the contributor to WCCB TV News Rising. Hello.
Hello.
How are you? And Eric Spanberg is back. He's managing editor of the Charlotte Business Journal. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Mike.
We're all on the radio. We're on Facebook Live. So we begin with the story along the coast. That's the sound of Hurricane Dorian as it picked up strength and began lashing the coast of the Carolinas. In addition to heavy rains and the flooding those rains are bringing, the storm surge came at high tide. Dorian also brought tornadoes to coastal communities, including North Myrtle Beach.
Holy crap. Definitely saw debris flying around in this. I don't know if it's touched all the way down to the ground, but
That's Wayne White observing part of a tornado's path through North Myrtle Beach yesterday. We're going to get the latest conditions and a report on the damage here. We had hoped to hear from Jonathan Lowe from Spectrum News, who's at the coast, but we can't reach him this morning, which tells me that perhaps cell service is not operable in that area of the country, but we've been watching it here from afar, and I think we can do justice to this. Dorian passed Charleston, South Carolina, late yesterday afternoon on the way toward Wilmington. I think it has scraped the coast at where? In
Cape
North
Fear
Carolina?
area.
Cape Fear?
Yeah.
So what other reports of the damage? Let's begin south. Let's begin in Charleston and Myrtle Beach first. What do we know?
So Charleston, the big issue there was flooding, and lots of images that we've seen on TV of waters coming into the ground floors of some of the buildings there. Apparently this storm is not as bad as some people expected and not as bad as Florence. In Charleston in particular, fortunate combination of the waters and the winds. The winds were actually blowing the floodwaters back out towards the ocean, and I think that's saved some damages.
Okay, we have with us now Jonathan Lowe from Spectrum News. We finally reached him. He's on the line with us. Where are you this morning, Jonathan? Hello, Jonathan. Jonathan once. No, not yet. Okay.
I hope he's okay.
We do, however, have WCNC-TV Chief Meteorologist Brad Panovich with us. Brad, good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you doing, Mike?
I'm very glad to hear your voice. Let's talk about this storm, because this could have been a really, really, really bad storm for our coastline, and it turned out not to be after just doing insane damage to the Bahamas. And in fact, if I recall correctly, they were really worried in Charleston about high tide, the impact of this storm at high tide, and the reverse occurred. The storm actually blew water away from Charleston at high tide.
Yeah, it just goes to show you that track is so important because it tracked just offshore. The strongest winds never really came to push the water inland. So they actually had, and the tide down there was pretty high, but the king tide last weekend, which they had a real big problem with, was actually higher than the surge that came in with Dorian. So they actually got pretty lucky about the timing and the track of the storm. Now, we just had a landfall in the U.S., and it was in North Carolina at 8:35 this morning. The center passed over Cape Hatteras. So the only landfall in the United States ended up being in North Carolina, but it was in the Outer Banks, and that was primarily because the Outer Banks stick out into the Atlantic.
Yeah.
The recurvature of these storms, the Outer Banks get hit a lot. And we really got lucky because the storm paralleled the coast. Sometimes that can be a bad thing if the storm's a slow mover, like we saw with Matthew a couple years ago. But in this case, it was moving quick enough that it didn't dump heavy rain. It didn't bring the heaviest winds inland either. And the surge was actually not as bad as it could have been if it made a direct hit. So just a subtle change in that track could have changed everything here in the Carolinas.
What was the wind speed when it made landfall at Cape Hatteras?
90 miles per hour is a Category 1. So And for the Outer Banks, I mean, that's not a little storm, but they can handle that, especially if it's moving fast like it is. Now, we'll have to watch today because that offshore wind is good for a surge on other parts of the coast. But if you know the Outer Banks, the sound side flooding could be an issue because as the wind blows offshore, it blows water from the Pamlico Sound into the west side of the Outer Banks. So they might have some of the highest surge numbers up there from the sound side flooding as the backside of the storm swings through the Outer Banks.
We're going to talk to Jonathan Lowe about damage, but tell me how many tornadoes this thing spawned in North or South Carolina.
It's going to be hard to count because there were so many, and then during the height of the storm, it's hard to confirm those. So the Weather Service is going to go out and try to confirm as many as they can. But I'll be honest with you, that was a big surprise yesterday to see that many tornadoes and how significant they were. We normally get tornadoes with landfalling tropical systems, but as a meteorologist looking at those tornadoes yesterday, those weren't little weak, brief tornadoes. Some of those were legit, like supercell type thunderstorms that you would see in a springtime setup. So those will probably end up causing most of the damage than the wind from the storm, which is, sometimes happens in this case. But right now, the number I have is 14 tornadoes touched down, but that might expand as they go out and survey the damage. And some of those areas, especially along the coast, Emerald Isle, that got hit really hard, that might end up being the most damage we see from the storm.
Yeah, I'm surprised to hear that you were surprised by this because our coastline was getting the brunt of the northeast quadrant of the hurricane, and the northeast quadrant is always the most violent quadrant. It's the one that spins off most of the tornadoes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But you don't normally see the kind of structure to the storms that we saw yesterday. The thing about tornadoes in tropical systems, they're sometimes really difficult to see on radar because they don't look the same. The ones yesterday were pretty easy to see because they were, classic supercell type thunderstorms with a very defined circulation. And when you see some of the video, you see how big some of those tornadoes were. So that first band that came through really, for whatever reason, and usually we think it's because the friction with the land slows down the lowest levels first and it creates this vorticity. And that's, I think, yesterday was just the perfect setup with that band, and the tornadoes were pretty prolific across the state.
We have Jonathan Lowe. Stay with me, Brad, but we have Jonathan Lowe on the line from the storm area. Jonathan, where are you this morning?
So I'm in Wilmington. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning. Jonathan Lowe with Spectrum News, I should point out. You're in Wilmington. They were kind of spared as well, I think. But what kind of damage do they have there? And what was it from? Was it from wind? Was it from flooding? What was it from?
So to Brad's point, the more significant part seemed to be when those tornado warnings were going on. That started before the sun even came up. That first outer band, and I should say, my hotel is in Wilmington, but I was closest to Riceville Beach, right at the Intracoastal Waterway, for much of I guess you would say, the brunt of the storm. But before we even started our day, that first outer band, it was almost like a really bad stormy summer day. I covered Hurricane Florence last year. That was a direct hit, category one. I do not remember any thunder. I heard a lot of thunder yesterday morning, a lot of lightning. And then I talked to somebody who got 12 tornado warning alerts on their phone. Mine went off quite a bit too, but that was before people, before the sun even came up, the phones started going off. So I think that was the most nerve-wracking part of yesterday with all of the tornado warnings. As far as damage, one of the tornadoes that touched down in Brunswick County made a direct hit on a neighborhood, and I think we counted at least 12 homes that got their roofs at least damaged or ripped off partially or altogether. So there was, and in Brunswick County is south of where I am. For the most part here in New Hanover County, it's not as significant from what I could see last night. Of course, it was dark. But I know when Hurricane Florence made landfall, the power outages were widespread. There were trees down everywhere. I just didn't see that last night.
We'll talk more with you in just a couple of seconds. I have to let Brad Panovich go, the chief meteorologist at NBC Charlotte. But before I do, Brad, we're out of it now, right? I know that Virginia is now kind of going to be brushed by this storm, but it's pretty much out to sea at this point, right? Once it's past Cape Hatteras.
Yeah, it is flying. By this afternoon, it's going to be several hundred miles offshore because it's going to be picking up speed as it merges with a cold front. It could clip Cape Cod up there, east of Boston as it goes to the north and east, and then it's up to the Canadian Maritimes where it'll be a pretty large extratropical storm, we call it, basically like a giant nor'easter. So it'll cause a lot of surf and ripped currents up the east coast and the northeast coast, but it's on its way to Canada, and by tonight it's going to be long gone, and then we'll start turning our attention to the rest of the Atlantic to see if we've got another system anytime soon because we are still in the peak of hurricanes.
That was my next question and my last question, actually, for you. Forecasters are predicting 5 to 9 Atlantic storms, hurricanes this season. That's above normal, and they say 2 to 4 of those will be major storms with winds over 110 miles per hour. Are they sticking with that?
Yeah, I would think so. We had a real quiet period there for a while. We had the biggest drought between the middle of July and the middle of August that we've ever seen. And it's always like clockwork. I tell you, get to September 1st, and it's like a switch goes off out there in the Atlantic, and everything starts getting active. So Dorian's moving away, but we've got 2 other waves that have come off Africa. One has just come off, and it's got a 70% chance of developing in the next 5 days. It's way out there, but another one ahead of it has about a 20% chance of development, and we still have a post-tropical storm, Gabrielle, out there. So it's still pretty active, and we got to keep an eye on. As we know in the Carolinas, you really aren't in the clear until you get to about the end of October.
Chief Meteorologist at NBC Charlotte, Brad Panovich, the weatherman who never sleeps. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it this morning. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Some of the biggest damage that at least we've seen in Charlotte, Jonathan Lowe, was in Emerald Isle. And maybe that's because they had television cameras ready to go in Emerald Isle, and so we keep seeing the tape. I don't know. But it was pretty severe because it was in a trailer park, and it was pretty much decimated. Was that the worst of the damage that occurred along the coastline in North and South Carolina, or were there other examples of that we just haven't seen here?
I think that was the worst of it, and as I mentioned, that tornado damage down in Brunswick County. I just haven't right now heard, and we haven't seen anything significant like we did, at least in the Wilmington area, because remember, Hurricane Florence, people are still coming back from that. There are a lot of people across the area that have not fully recovered from Hurricane Florence, so I just haven't heard of anything. Of course, though, this all kind of ramped up as the sun was going down yesterday, so whatever happened in the dark. So I think a lot of people are waiting, as the sun comes
Yesterday afternoon, there were reports of about 240,000 people being out of power. I'm sure that number has increased. Do you have a current figure?
Oh, yeah.
Do you have a current figure?
What was that, Mike?
I said, do you have a current figure on the number of people without power?
No,
David Borax does. He's sitting next to me.
Actually, I've just been checking the Duke Energy and Dominion Energy sites, and there's about 120,000 people in North and South Carolina who are Duke customers who are without power right now, about 50,000 in the Dominion area. So that's about 170 total, plus some smaller electric systems. It looks like maybe they're doing a pretty good job of getting some of those South Carolina outages repaired at this point.
I think there are people here from 3 different maybe more than 3 different electric companies, plus 23 states have sent people, and Canada sent people, and they were staging in Florence, I think, to move toward the coastline. We have about 30 seconds left, Jonathan, less than that. How far inland did people experience damage or outages?
Oh, it was pretty far inland. I know that I heard some reports as far as like Anson County, so that's getting into the Charlotte region, and that was an area that was decimated last year with flooding. So,
Jonathan Lowe from Spectrum News, thank you for being with us this morning. We will continue in just a moment on Charlotte Talks. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Mazda of South Charlotte, committed to Mazda's focus to ensure every element of a car is designed around the driver. More at MazdaofSouthCharlotte.com. Bill Kristol has had a long career in politics as a teacher, then a staff member in the Reagan and Bush administrations. He's the founder of the Weekly Standard. Well, these days, Bill Kristol is spending time in the Charlotte region, serving as the Vann Professor of Ethics and Society at Davidson College, and he'll be giving a talk Monday night at Davidson about the coming presidential election entitled 2020. It only gets worse from here. We'll get his thoughts about the nature of politics today and what he says we should expect this election season coming up on this program Monday at 9. We're coming right back.
Millions are in harm's way on the East Coast from Hurricane Dorian. Off the West Coast, questions remain after a dive boat disaster. And the country's biggest retailers stopped selling the bullets that can be used in assault-style rifles and handguns. The Friday News Roundup next time on 1A.
The Roundup of the Week's news continues with 1A from 10 to noon, right after the Charlotte Talks Local News Roundup. Here on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
It's the local news roundup on Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're here with Mary C. Curtis from Roll Call and WCCB-TV, Eric Spanberg from the Business Journal, and then David Borax and Steve Harrison, both from WFAE News. There was another storm brewing this week on Twitter with the president in Alabama, which we will not talk about. There's no reason to talk about that, but there's still another storm with regard to the president that's been brewing as well. Well in advance of the storm on Tuesday, he tweeted, at the request of Senator Tom Tillis, I am getting the North Carolina Emergency Declaration completed and signed tonight. Hope you won't need it. But that request came from the governor. And there's some disgruntlement about whether or not Tom Tillis should have responded to the tweet with saying, thank you for replying to the governor's request, Mr. President. But he didn't. Should we talk about that at all?
Well, the governor is a Democrat. Didn't you know that?
Politics during a disaster?
I can't believe it.
And
Shame.
everything is partisan nowadays.
So as somebody, either Jonathan or Brad mentioned a minute ago that a lot of the areas that were threatened and in fact impacted by Dorian we're still recovering from Hurricane Florence, which came 11 months ago, and a lot of the money for that evidently is still being held up at the federal level. Did their worries about flooding and damage bear fruit?
Well, Mike, we still have to see how the storm surge affects the Outer Banks. And as Brad Panovich mentioned a minute ago, some of the biggest threat that still remains is winds and storm surge coming from the sound side on the Outer Banks, which could affect that in a way that we still don't know about. But it does look like we dodged the worst of it to here. And I just want to back up and say, you know, the real story about Dorian is the Bahamas and the devastation there, and we can't forget that. But back to the question about North Carolina, you know, some of these areas were still recovering from the previous two storms. I mean, the U.S. spent almost $2 billion so far on recovering from Florence, another $1 billion from Matthew in 2016. And it is there are people who are still getting back into their homes or who are not into their homes yet. And there's a lot of discussion about what do we do during future storms? How can we be more resilient? A couple of weeks ago, I covered a conference on this topic up at Duke University, and the state has a new chief resilience officer whose job is to worry about this and to worry about how we spend less money after storms and get better results. And she suggested that we can't just build back the way it was in an era of future storms and climate change.
Are we allowed to consider climate by law in North Carolina? Because at one point the legislature said, no, you can't consider the climate in planning.
Well, for these purposes, yeah, we can do that. And I think we're seeing a little bit of a relaxation on that discussion about the 30-year horizon and all of that.
Okay.
Well, you see more and more discussion of folks saying, should you rebuild? Should they pay to rebuild on these areas that keep getting hit again and again?
So throw those figures, the numbers out again.
So it's actually, as of June, middle of this summer, it was $1.7 billion on recovery from Florence. That was federal funds, plus state funds on top of that, and then about $1 billion on Matthew.
And state officials have said that that is nowhere near enough money to fix the damage.
Exactly. And, you know, so there are two questions here. How do we make sure we're better prepared so that the damage isn't as bad? How do we make changes, as Mary and I have just mentioned, that, you know, not building back in flood-prone areas? And how do we keep the aftermath of these storms from being such a tragedy?
Can you insure a house on the beach? Will insurance companies cover you anymore? I mean, it seems to me that the pressure is going to come from insurance companies who either won't write policies or will start losing so much money on fires and storms and floods that they'll say, that's it, we're done.
You can still get federal flood insurance, and there are different levels of it.
But we're paying for that.
Everybody is
right?
paying for that.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right, early voting is underway in the 9th Congressional District, as we all know, which stretches almost to the coast, about 2 counties away from the ocean. Several counties reportedly closed their early voting locations because of the impending storm. Is that expected to have any measurable impact, Steve, on either early voting or on the outcome of this election?
So I think it's hard to say because the counties that were impacted are pretty small. They don't have a lot of voters. Most of the votes in this district come from Mecklenburg and Union counties. But for Dan McCready, the Democrats have done, in all 8 counties in the 9th District, they have kind of outperformed how they did in 2018. They're getting a greater share of votes coming out. So I think for McCready, there would be a push to have early voting go on as long as possible. Mm-hmm. Now, yesterday, both candidates...
I was going to say both candidates, right.
Both candidates said they wanted the local elections boards to try and open back up on Saturday.
And are they going to add hours to that?
Well, that's what both candidates want.
That's what they want. There hasn't been a final decision yet, at least that I had seen yet.
So we don't know if those counties will, in fact, even open.
Right.
Yeah, the latest news is they're considering it, but they haven't made the decision. And, traditionally, I think Democrats do better in early voting and Republicans do better on Election Day.
Plus, this is the part of the country, part of the district, I should say, where it seems to me that Dan Bishop would do better than Dan McCready, correct?
Well, I mean, but... take Robinson County, which had to curtail its early voting hours. That is it's not a big population county, but it is a big county for Dan McCready. That has the UNC Pembroke, which is so that is a college campus. The Lumbee Native American tribe is there. There were a lot of McCready votes there. And it's interesting looking at Bladen County now. Bladen County was won back in the fall, 2 counties that Mark Harris won. Of course, there was so many shenanigans there. So far in Bladen County, with no one doing mail voting in any significant way, Bladen County now kind of looks like these other counties.
M-A-I-L, right?
That's right, yes. That's right.
They got into a little trouble at that last time.
There was some ballot harvesting, I heard.
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe something like that.
So this week, a 3-judge panel of state trial judges, 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, unanimously rejected the state's legislative district maps, doing what the Supreme Court in Washington refused to do with the state's congressional maps. The state panel said that these districts are unconstitutional because of partisan gerrymandering. Bob Phillips from Common Cause, one of the plaintiffs in the case, had this reaction.
This is a big moment for everyone, I guess, in this long drama of trying to end gerrymandering in North Carolina.
Was this a surprise, this decision?
I think the bigger surprise so far has been the reaction from Phil Berger, the Senate president, who has said that, at least for the moment, they don't plan to fight this, that the Democrats have simply decided to use the courts to get their way. Of course, he said, and I quote, "This is part of a national Democratic strategy to overturn Republican rule via the courts." Here's something it's obvious, but it's interesting, which is, so we had all this buildup to the Supreme Court decision in the summer about the congressional maps in North Carolina and whether they would be changed due to partisan gerrymandering. And the Supreme Court came back in a 5-4 decision and says, no, this is not our bailiwick. This is something that should be decided by state courts. Yeah. Then we get
legislatures.
Or legislatures. And so we get into this decision by state superior court this week, and you have this decision that will obviously require new maps, but then you have the plaintiff's attorney saying, look, the same thing is going to happen with the congressional districts if we make that case, which you can be assured they will.
So let's get this straight. Democrats say that this partisan gerrymandering is occurring all over the country where Republicans are in charge of state legislatures because it's part of that. This is what Democrats say. It's part of what that party's effort, the Republican Party's effort, to keep themselves in power by gerrymandering districts in their favor and by suppressing the vote because that's the only way they can win. Those are the words of Democrats. And then you've got Phil Berger saying this overturning of these gerrymandered districts is because that's part of the national Democratic strategy to overturn Republican rule. Who's right?
So they're probably both right?
Yeah.
It is a strategy. The Democrats are going to state courts because that's their best chance
And
the thing
go
of it
ahead,
is they wrote a 357-page, very thorough ruling, and it basically laid out that this really hinders democracy because you have cases like in North Carolina where Democrats may get the majority of the votes, but when you look at the seats, the Republicans hold the seats.
Right.
And so they're saying the way they're drawn, you will never have basically one vote, one person, one vote. And, you know, in North Carolina also, Phil Berger and others realize that the state court is dominated by Democrats. So if they take it up to that, it's 6-1.
It's 6-1.
Yeah, Democrats.
You know, a couple of important things about this decision. One is the fact that it requires an open, public, transparent process of drawing the new maps.
How do you do that?
You do it in
public?
In public, yes. I mean, you
They can't go into a meeting room and draw the maps. They have to do it in full view.
That's
Apparently,
what the ruling
you
says.
have to have your screens facing the audience.
Yes.
They want live streaming of this.
And not only that,
Excellent.
not only that, the court oversees any consultants who are brought in. Remember, there was all this discussion of the late Republican consultant who was brought into this case. So I think those are very important. And then the other point I would bring up that is really key is that if they are if the court is unhappy with the maps that come to them, and if they feel like there is a delay, in essence, a stall tactic, they have said they will move the March primary. So
I think,
that puts a lot of pressure.
I was going to say, I mean, just quickly, the entire maps, House and Senate maps, don't have to be redrawn. There's like about 30 counties that are impacted. Mecklenburg is one of those. What I think is interesting about Mecklenburg is that.
But isn't this like dominoes? If you draw,
exactly.
If you change one, it changes.
Yeah, I mean, there's but it doesn't mean you have to kind of like tear up everything. But in Mecklenburg, we've got 12 House seats and 5 Senate seats, I think. And so right now, Democrats, that's 17. Democrats hold 16. So it's like, I'm not sure locally what is going to change. And the one Senate seat is held by Dan Bishop in South Charlotte. It is a Republican seat. It was designed to protect him. But then you kind of say, like, if I'm a Republican in Mecklenburg County, shouldn't I have at least one representative in this? You know, there are 40% of us, 35% Republicans.
Registered Republicans, correct.
This could go the other way. I remember what happened here is the Republicans drew it. They packed Democratic districts. You know, if there's something wrong with that, the only logical conclusion is they'll have to unpack some of those and reduce the number of Democrats in some of those Mecklenburg County districts. So this could go the other way for the Democrats.
We should mention, Mike, it's 2 Democrats and 1 Republican in terms of the makeup of the 3-judge panel that rendered this.
I'm
sorry. I
That's
apologize.
okay.
I should listen better.
No, it bears repeating. It was 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, but the decision was unanimous. On the part of those judges. In their decision, they wrote, partisan intent predominated over all other redistricting criteria, resulting in extreme partisan gerrymandered legislative maps. The effect of these carefully crafted partisan maps is that in all but the most unusual election scenarios, the Republican Party will control the majority of both chambers. In other words, the court finds that in many election environments, it is the carefully crafted maps and not the will of the voters that dictate the election outcomes and ultimately majority control of the General Assembly. Yeah. This seems like a slam dunk.
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty assertive decision. One of the things that really jumped out at me, Mary mentioned 357-page ruling, is they used the phrase surgical precision. And anyone who's followed this closely will recall that was used previously in the decision against the 2016 voter ID law. So these 3 judges clearly felt strongly that this was nowhere near being an adequate district makeup.
This was the case, and you mentioned this earlier, Eric, in which it was revealed that the consultant that helped them draw these maps, the late Tom Heffler, who died, and then his daughter came forward with his computer files that indicated that these maps were like ready-made and on purpose drawn. How big a role did that play in this decision?
It was huge. So, like Eric said, 357-page ruling. Hoffler's name came up 201 times. So it was just all through the entire ruling.
Yeah.
And
Call it a smoking gun.
Yeah, he's the gift that keeps on giving
And
because
so-
he shows intent.
And you know, and the Republicans brought him in on multiple occasions. The Democrats would say, "Hey, we'd like to talk to Tom Hoffler," and nope, not at all. You know, completely shut out. And that and I think this is what makes kind of today's gerrymandering a little bit different than 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago. Just with computer technology, you could do this so carefully and
so much better.
So much better.
You could do it so much better, yeah.
And he was great at it.
Yeah,
So-
they split up, city blocks to do this. Yeah.
So they have until September the 18th
Yes.
to accomplish the redraw to the satisfaction of the court. And the court has, as you said, mandated complete sunshine in this. So when does the process start? Can they really do it by September the 18th? And what will the decision of the court be? I mean, what is the criteria they will use to decide whether these maps have been fairly drawn?
I mean, what they talked about in the ruling was that it just cannot take into account political leaning or
anything that they've used in the past, essentially, is what they said.
So what will they
It
take
says-
into account? There's a person over here, there's a person over here, we'll put them in different districts.
Well, I mean, I think some of the obvious things they're looking at are the cracking and packing that we always talk about in these cases, where you have, is it North Carolina A&T, the campus, where, you literally had, and I'm using congressional districts in this case, but you had a different district, basically across the street, all kinds of strange neighborhoods where you have.
Won't that always happen? You'll have a district across the street. You have to put the line someplace.
Yes, but it is, as Steve said, it is more extreme now because you do have the computer data that you can really slice and dice in a way that you just simply couldn't in the past. And so I think they said it pretty clearly. They're looking for a way that the maps are much more representative of the population as a whole. And the vote is basically 50-50 statewide cumulatively, Mike. So that's what they're looking for.
And this is getting a lot of national attention because after the Supreme Court ruling, people are saying, okay, partisan gerrymandering, that's fine. But now people are looking at it and saying, look what happened in North Carolina. Maybe other states can use that as a roadmap.
Will this have an impact on either other cases in North Carolina or other cases around the country?
Absolutely, it will. And I think there was a reference to the rule in North Carolina, the law in North Carolina that would apply in about half of the states right now. In terms of the will of the people, I think it was the piece that one of the pieces that was cited. So yeah, it will definitely be used.
How does that work? Because this was a state court. This was not a federal court that made this decision.
It doesn't have a directive. It's not a precedent in other states, but it's a legal
used
strategy that other states can use to change their systems.
Yes.
So this is actually a very, very big deal. I think you said, Steve, that the impact of this cannot be overstated. Why?
Well, one reason is we're getting ready to go into the census next year. So the new legislature will draw their own House and Senate maps, and they'll draw that congressional map. And so let's say if the Democrats can get one seat, one chamber in the General Assembly, then they have a seat at the table because they're redistricting. The maps don't go before the governor. So I think it has this, like we all just talked about, this national precedent. But here locally, we're going to be drawing 3 maps: Congress, House and Senate, and
after the 2020
after
census.
2020. And so this legislature will be in charge of all that.
Okay. So what might this do to the makeup of the legislature after the next election?
Well, I mean, one thing that Steve is hinting at is, so what if you now have one of these chambers that is controlled by the Democrats and they have a seat at the table, which is the Republicans have been controlling this map-making process since 2010/11. That would change things.
David?
You have to look at this for the long term and ask what comes next after this. And clearly the courts are saying that we have to change the way we do this, and I think it raises this idea of a nonpartisan redistricting commission or some process by which we draw these districts without party politics.
Speaking of districts, we come back and talk about the Dans of District 9 and what that race looks like at the moment, and the arts tax. We'll get an update on that, too, and more as time allows. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
In some states.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and doctors making house calls, 105 primary care and specialty clinicians helping complex patients avoid unnecessary ER visits and hospitalizations. Clinical positions available throughout the Carolinas. Info at doctorsmakinghousecalls.com. Well, the roundup of the week's news continues in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A with a look around the nation. Hurricane Dorian moving up the east coast of the U.S. after devastating the Bahamas. Democratic presidential candidates' climate change plans come under scrutiny during last night, or not last, well, it wasn't last night, it was 2 nights ago's climate town hall on CNN. The Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services releases a report saying that the children who were separated from their families at the border are not receiving proper mental health care. That and much more with Joshua Johnson and his roundtable of reporters coming up, and we'll continue with ours right after this.
Another election is coming, and it's time to start getting to know who the candidates are, even if it seems like there are about 1,000 of them.
We've got to make sure that people know that
we have to actually get these things done in a big, bold way.
Because if it is not job one, it won't get done.
Whether you wake up on the right side of the bed, or the left side, or somewhere in the middle, hear opening arguments from presidential hopefuls on Morning Edition from NPR News.
Tune in weekday mornings from 5 to 9 on WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're here on the local news roundup with Steve Harrison and David Borax, both from WFAE News. Mary C. Curtis from the Roll Call, columnist for Roll Call, contributor to WCCB TV, and Eric Spanberg, managing editor of the Charlotte Business Journal. It all ends, I tell you, in 4 days, if luck will have it. Of course, I'm talking about the 9th District congressional race. Republican State Senator Dan Bishop has replaced Mark Harris, as we all know, in this rematch with Democrat Dan McCready. And Bishop says this race could be the canary in the coal mine. Well, it's certainly neck and neck at the moment. The last poll showed McCready slightly ahead, 46 to 42%, but that's well within the margin of error, so it's tied, essentially. And Dan Bishop, when he was on this program yesterday, painted himself as the underdog because McCready has been running now for over 2 years.
That is certainly was one of the challenges from the outset and continues to be a challenge. He has an enormous advantage by virtue of the time that he's been in the race, 27 or 28 months. He's raised and spent $12 million, a ton of it from outside North Carolina and outside the district. There's been outside spending beyond that in the terms of several $1 million. And he was sort of able to stow up money while we had a primary.
So Bishop is the more experienced politician. He has the support of the president, who is coming here on election eve. He's coming to Fayetteville to campaign for him on election eve. Don Jr. and Mike Pence's wife, and I believe Mike Pence, have been here campaigning for him. Is Bishop the underdog?
Well, I think that's kind of disingenuous. This is, after all, a district that in the 2016 Trump won by about 12 percentage points, and it is one of those gerrymandered districts that's pretty solidly Republican. But of course, people are looking toward this. It's one race, but they're looking nationally as a preview of 2020. And basically, you see the Republicans going all in with the president and vice president and everyone coming in because they realize that if McCready wins or if he even comes close, that they don't want that to be a harbinger for what might happen in 2020.
Well, is this the canary in the coal mine? I mean, the president is coming. All the heavy hitters from Washington have been here. Could the outcome of this be a predictor of what might happen to Donald Trump, at least in this district and perhaps in this state in 2020?
Yeah, I think so. I think for sure. And I think that the cut you played earlier when Dan Bishop was talking about McCready's advantages, on Tuesday night, I think this will be a national story. Everyone will be watching this race. And so I'm not saying Dan Bishop thinks he's not going to win, but that was in a way kind of the talking point that will be conveyed if the Democrats do win this seat.
Dan McCready, the Democrat, won't say, or at least he wouldn't say it to me on the show yesterday, whether he sees the race as a preview of 2020. He also would not directly answer my question yesterday about whether he feels he has the support of national Democrats, because I pointed out that everyone in the known Republican universe has been here for Dan Bishop, and I don't recall very many heavy hitters from the Democratic Party.
Well, remember, part of his strategy has been in some of his ads, he doesn't even identify his party. Right. So I think, yes, it's a bellwether in some ways, but in others, no, because when you look at the presidential contest, of course, whoever the candidate is going to be much more to the left than McCready is in this race.
And Dan McCready was very happy to point out that Dan Bishop, quote, absolutely needs, end quote, Donald Trump's election eve campaign stop in Fayetteville.
Dan Bishop's obviously terrified. He won't run on his agenda because his agenda includes taking health care away from people, gutting public school funding, and going to extreme partisanship, which is the problem in this country. So he's bringing in, everybody and their mom to come bail him out.
As you mentioned, he kind of distances himself sometimes from the party itself. He does portray himself as a maverick, vowing to put country over party, which is admirable, it seems to me. And no matter which party you're in, doing that seems to be the right thing to do if you can actually do it. But then, can you do it as a freshman congressman who wants to get something done? And a congressman who is a freshman candidate, a candidate for Congress, who has called other Democrats, particularly presidential candidates, crazy and aspirational.
Well, you can see this as a preview of strategy as well, because Bishop is trying to tie McCready to national Democrats, not all national Democrats, basically the squad and as far left. And you can see that that's going to be the strategy in 2020, that the Republicans will hug on tight to Trump and try to portray any Democrat, even the ones who won in moderate districts in 2018, as being too far left.
Well, and also, Mike, it should be mentioned, though, that he is accepting national money, so he's not completely apolitical.
So I want to point out that Dan McCready did say on this program that Dan Bishop absolutely needs the support of the president, but that Dan Bishop also said those exact words on Fox News after he left this program yesterday to be on Fox News. So they both agree that they absolutely need the president.
Finally, we have consensus.
What do we know about voter turnout in this race, early voter turnout in this race, and what does it say about the possible outcome?
So if you compare it to 2018, fewer people have voted early because this is a special election. Last year was, a big midterm. So that's not a surprise. Of the people who have voted early, the people who are registered Democrats have increased their share about 2.5 percentage points. Republicans are down about 2%. Like Mary said earlier, of course, Republicans will have a big surge on Election Day. But then the Democrats have to be pleased so far that they've increased their turnout. Not a lot, but a little bit. And this race was essentially tied last time. So
well, that's why the president's coming election eve. I'm sure he wants that big boost of folks who come.
Yeah, let's remember 905 votes last time. So
there have been lots of Democrats who have been here, presidential candidates, campaigning because North and South Carolina, particularly South Carolina, are vitally important. I would think to that race. Have they spoken on behalf of McCready, either because they've stumped with him or been on the same platform with him, or they just know I'm here, I ought to mention this guy?
It's more I'm here, but last week Beto O'Rourke was at a brewery near UNCC, and Joe Biden was at a town hall in Rock Hill at a historically black college, Clinton College, and they both mentioned Dan McCready, probably Beto O'Rourke a little bit more, but they support him and said, we need folks like that in Congress. So they both mentioned them. But this isn't the first time they've been here. It won't be the last, because North Carolina is a true swing state, and South Carolina is an early primary state and also very diverse, as opposed to, say, Iowa and New Hampshire. And particularly for Joe Biden, who's at the top of the polls, particularly with the support of African-American voters. This is important for him. So, you saw the two of them, the different energies and enthusiasms. I was very struck by the fact that the national press, in a sense, they talk about some of Joe Biden's gaffes and things like that, but there was a real affection for him at the town hall. I asked one woman about the gaffes. She said, well, that's not age-related, that's Joe-related. It just, we're all human. And there's a lot of good faith, because also he was President Obama's vice president. And he does have a touch with people. Beto O'Rourke spoke, literally
and figuratively.
He did hug, but he asked for permission before he hugged. Beto O'Rourke, of course, particularly since the massacre in El Paso, his hometown, has been very passionate on the issue of gun violence. And he talked a lot about, the brewery was close to UNCC. And he brought that up, and that was an issue he does, speak very eloquently and passionately about.
By the way, Mike, I just want to mention real quickly. So if Dan McCready is trying to be apolitical, he was endorsed by Joe Biden earlier this month.
So the conversation over whether to put a referendum on the November ballot for an increase in our sales tax to support arts, parks, and greenways continued on Wednesday night. County Manager Dina DiOrio recommended that if the tax goes through, The Arts and Science Council, which has traditionally managed the coffers and distributed the funds collected privately, would have to be more transparent if their money came from the taxes. And it turns out that the county commission wants members of the commission to be on the Arts and Science Council board. It would be a smaller staff at the Arts and Science Council because most of the work can be done by the county, and they want city council people on this board. The city hasn't chimed in on this yet, have they?
So I think the big change Wednesday night was the manager she wanted to put 4 commissioners on the board, because it's their tax money. They would have more of a say. But under her proposal, the ASC would still have the final say in distributing the money. Okay. Trevor Fuller came back and said, no, we need to be accountable. Trevor Fuller wants the ASC to make recommendations on grants and those to come back before the commission, and the commission would ultimately decide.
So I understand his reasoning, because he says he doesn't want to give $25 million of the $50 million would go to the Arts and Science Council. The rest would go ostensibly, because they're not married to this. That doesn't have to go where they say it's going to go. But he doesn't want $25 million to go to an organization who will then just take tax money and spend it how they please. He wants accountability. On the other hand, Chairman George Dunlop says this would result in the county having to rubber stamp hundreds of allocations. Would they be rubber stamping them, or would they actually be analyzing this and saying, yeah, this is a good idea, or this is a bad idea?
I think that's a really good question. And one of the issues...
And are they qualified to make these decisions?
Well, that's another question here is you described it one way. Another way to look at it is politics, and the county commission is going to get involved in arts allocation. And that another way to look at it is that a good thing for us?
No,
who should be making those decisions? Right now, the Arts and Science Council has panels of experts in different areas who make these decisions.
And that's one of the things you've heard from Pat Cotham, who is really the loudest and sometimes the lone dissenting voice on this whole idea, is that it's haphazard and that the county is not really prepared to take this level of
Let me tell you why I
involvement.
said no, it's not. History. Years ago, the ASC bowed to pressure when the Charlotte Repertory Theater successfully, I might point out, staged Angels in America. And for those not here at the time, this was HB2, before HB2. The fallout, which was largely an overreaction to a very small minority of protesters, had far-reaching consequences around the country for the publicity that it provided Charlotte, and the negative publicity, once again, over provinciality, and also to the arts world, which really suffered, and I think it ultimately led to the demise of one of the premier theater companies in the Southeast, Charlotte Repertory Theater. And the reason that this controversy was able to gain traction was due in part to the fact that the county was involved in a lot of the venues in which these artistic groups performed, and they didn't want to support things that they thought the citizenry might object to, which is, I think, correct. But when you get the county involved in choosing who's going to be funded and what kinds of things will be funded, that's not good for the arts.
The lobbying. Okay, I think Eric and we see this at the city council when they hand out grant money for like after school programs.
Yes,
they will have the city will have kind of its like staff members who will vet them and go through this whole process of like, we think these nonprofits are the best, and then the people who get shut out often lobby council members and say, what about me, and then we kind of like tear up the whole process. So I can see this with the arts grants funding.
Yeah,
a huge scrum of recommendations are made,
and late in budget process. That's when it's always.
And the way it works right now with the Arts and Science Council is their panels come up with their decisions, and an announcement is made, and that's it.
Yeah. So, what has the ASC said about this idea?
It's interesting. I haven't heard the ASC say whole lot about this. And Mike, a couple weeks ago on this show, we talked about the rollout of the campaign, which I guess is forthcoming. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. I should mention once again, 2014, this quarter-cent idea was on the ballot and lost by 22 percentage points. So it's not a given. This will be, I think, a really interesting conversation for the community.
It seems to me they have a lot to iron out before they put this on the ballot, like exactly who from the county commission will be on it, how many members of the city council will be on it, whether in fact they want to do that at all. And November is just around the corner.
We're 2 months away from Election Day, and all these details, important details, still have not been finalized.
And I was going to say just one more thing, if I could.
Yep.
we have two other special sales taxes, right? We have one for transit, and we have these hotel, motel, and prepared food and beverage taxes. The transit tax goes to CATS. That is a public organization. Everything you can get, emails, text messages, documents, the same with the Charlotte Regional Visitors Authority. That is all public as well. So we had this discussion about who would make the decision with the ASC, but the structure they have now is it's still a nonprofit.
Yes.
That's not a public organization.
Tell me why, please somebody tell me why we have those two dedicated taxes that you just talked about. The money that comes in must go to those things. But in this case, the money doesn't have to go to the arts, parks, or greenways. It can go any way they want to, and it's not going to be on the ballot as a referendum to raise taxes for the arts, parks, and greenways. It's a referendum to raise taxes.
Because the state legislature set the rules for this particular quarter cent that is available to every county in North Carolina, and they stipulated you cannot explain what it is. It's simply a yes, no. And
why would they do that?
For the local municipality, that makes it harder to pass. It would be one opinion, I think. Okay. But also, they put this out there as the local municipalities determine how they'll spend this money, whereas in the cases that Steve is bringing up, those were things that originated here, and people went to the legislature and said, can we do this? And they said yes.
Okay, we have a minute and a half, actually about a minute. The state released grades for the schools this week, both the charter schools and CMS. WFAE's education reporter Ann Doss-Helms reported this week that just over 200 of the state's 2,500 public schools earned A's from the state. Half as many earned F's. We overperformed the state average on the upside, but underperformed on the downside. Talk about that, David, can you?
Yeah, it turns out that Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools and charter schools statewide tended to be in the A group and also in the D and F group. And, this was passed, and these are inaugurated in 2013 to hold educators and elected officials accountable for how they spend money. And it says also, though, Ann Doss-Helms reports that it says as much about the skills that children arrive with as the work that teachers do. The other thing that came out of this is that there's a racial line here. Majority white schools did better, got in the A group, and low-performing schools and minority schools tended to do not as well.
Is there poverty line, too?
Yes. Is there any news there? Isn't that always the case?
It is typically the case.
So Ernest Winston, the new CMS superintendent, didn't seem all that pleased, but he said, we own this. Is there a plan to fix it? There's been lots of plans to fix this, and nothing happened.
This is the central problem that CMS faces right now, and they're trying different ways to do it.
David Borak, Steve Harrison from WFAE News, Mary C. Curtis from Roll Call, and Eric Spanberg from the Charlotte Business Journal. Thank you all for the hour.